hello again. So today we will be constructing a probe to throw at the moon, possibly other planets. That's a neat thing about the Ranger / Mariner program, is that, let's see, I think that's it, is that a number of a probe design that worked to throw things at the moon was also relatively effective for throwing things at other planets. So I'll kind of design this and test it for throwing things at the moon and go from there. So this is a design from Schnobs, or Schnobs, however you pronounce his name, if you knew how to pronounce his name right. Let's see, am I able to change that? Oh, maybe I'm not. Darn. All right, well, I'm just going to drain you then, because I don't want nitrous oxide. So this is a nice probe that the name I just tried to say gave to me, which is nice. Thank you very much. So I've changed it to fill with hydrazine, changed this little engine to be hydrazine. So this is a probe I'm going to throw at the moon. So this delta V doesn't matter much, just to make sure it has control of itself. It's got RCS quads. It looks very nice, definitely as nice or nicer than I would be able to build one. So awesome. So let's progress from there. So let's go to the Bakey Kitchen and steal from our sub-assemblies. So off screen I constructed a sub-assembly for an Agena D. So if you just quickly look at the numbers there, if you want to pause or whatever, it's got more delta V. It's not a ton more, okay, it's 3 times expensive. I guess it is a lot more expensive. And it's twice the mass of the Agena A. So it's going to be a heavier upper stage. It would be more of a challenge for, say, our Thor to throw, 7.2 tons versus 50 tons on a first stage. It would be harder for our Thor to throw anything meaningful with it. So I just grabbed my Agena D, boop. Pretty nice. I'll do different things with that later. This is the Agena D I constructed from FASA parts. I just like FASA because the parts will look nice. I can just clip them together. I'm a model assembler kind of guy rather than spend a bunch of time in the VAB trying to tweak all the procedural parts and textures and such to look nice. I just, bam, 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 threw these parts on. They're configured for a reason in Realism Overhaul and RP-0. The one thing I didn't have, you can see I have a proc tank here, is RCS for it. So I put 4 little guys here to point and to ullage this engine. Now this looks like the engine we used before. Oh, and these will allow me to kind of point this in whatever direction I'd like. But it's got avionics in here. It's got tons of fuel in here. That's why it's so much heavier than the my Agena A. And it has a different engine. I've got the current config. I've jumped configs. So if you just compare really the thrust, weight, not a ton different, a bit more efficient, but it has 2 ignitions. So it's the first upper stage reignitable engine I will be using, which, oh man, it's good to enter this era of technology. It's nice hardware. And so let's clip on an Atlas D. Just pull that out of the sub-assembly bucket there, and basically that's what we're going to be throwing into the sky. And obviously that would need to be higher, need to throw fairings and nice things on it. So if we go to the pre-baked oven, I basically did exactly this, except unmangled the staging because I still am very much learning how to use those guys, those sub-assemblies. So, Agena Probe 1. I'm not sure why it's telling me about contains locked or invalid parts. That might surprise me at some point, if I try to actually construct this and it yells at me. But I did already do a test, or it wouldn't be a legit pre-bake. Come on, load up. There we go. So I've staged everything all nice. The delta V is a little spazzed out there. It's a little unclear. I'm not sure why it's doing that. But one thing I do want to change, before I build my real one, I will probably change the fairings, because I'd like it to look, the fairings on it to look a little more like the actual Mariner, or Ranger. But I will extract that nitrous oxide since I'm not actually using that, and I don't think I need it. I don't think I need to use that volume for anything else. I could obviously be wrong, but all right, grab those, save it. So I'm going to do a test flight and basically try to put this into an orbit where I could throw something at the moon. And if I feel like I have the time, I might just do a quick test throw of this at the moon. So let's see, pull that engine out. Okay, so staging's all nicely set up here. All the engines will light to the ground. We will release the launch clamps. In the air, we will drop the booster when we choose to. Sometime after that point, we will get rid of our fairings, much below the altitudes I usually do. Usually I am too distracted to drop them off, but this should be a nice, happy craft to fly unless an engine fails. Then basically separate the two stages, at which point I might have to ullage the fuel, which is why I separated these out. Don't want to try to spend at ignition when it might not be worth it. And then there's kind of an auxiliary engine on the actual probe itself for later on. So let's go throw this out. Simulate. So it's cost me a good chunk of change, but apparently I got a good chunk of change. That's not all stolen money. That is a lot of that is cash from our return of the probe from orbit. Even though we probably need to give back the cash for the contract we didn't complete, which was to achieve that specific orbit. But fortunately, that wasn't a lucrative contract, so it's not like there's much money to give back for that one. So in this video, I showed the construction. I'm going to try to fly this up to orbit, possibly to the moon, or to just confirm at the very least that it can get a close approach to the moon. I might have to buy more time now that I think about it. I only paid for 20 minutes of this craft, so one path around the Earth would take me 90 minutes. So, or I might kind of show how I split the difference of doing a decent simulation. So there you can see the shameful purple contract I failed to complete. So select the moon, relative inclination. So unfortunately it is going to be a nighttime launch to the moon, so everything will be darker than minimal. Thankfully, thankfully we're not losing electricity on the pad here, so I don't have to do any funky hyper-edit stuff. There we go, so we're well within the plane of the moon there. Probably by the time we do the real launch and construction of this, hopefully, well, enough time will have passed for sure that it won't be the same kind of portion of the night when we're doing the launch. So at least that we know. Whoa, it kind of picked up a little bit of a wobble there. So let me just set it up. Did any engines or something fail? Just tap F3, no. And, oh yeah, good, the little HUD is still open there. So a lot of these engines are fresh. They don't have much data. Like this, that's my Agena engine. It got a little bit of tech transfer from the earlier version. Not a ton, it still doesn't have a ton of data, but decently reliable. And similarly, we haven't really used the -5, 6, or -5 versions of these engines much, so not a ton, nowhere near maximal experience, but still not that high of a chance that it will fail. Just engines become more and more reliable as you progress. And that's a bit of a balance. I kind of like if new hardware had a decent chance of failing in one of the first, like say 3 flights or something, that one of those would fail. I think that would be a nice kind of thing to balance for in test flight, but in reality, pretty much the first 2 or 3 like actual kind of flight tests would all fail. But obviously we don't want to go that far either. So it's kind of a bit of a choice about how unreliable things are created. Yeah, I pulled up a couple pictures of Mariner. Whoa, speaking of unreliable engines. Oh darn. So you can see one of my engines failed and it popped up right there. So that's test flight doing its job. So this mission could totally fail. Because it is just a simulation, I'm just going to quickly revert and do it anyway because I'm midway through a video. In practice, at this point in career, I'm totally fine with a mission failing, right? I mean, that's part of the fun of test flight for me, is like I was literally just saying, some percentage, well above 1%, well below 50% of missions will fail, particularly when the hardware isn't very reliable. You haven't used it a number of times, or you haven't put money into researching it. So I'm totally fine with a failure like that. If it happened in a real mission, I'd eat it. I'm fine with that. This is just a simulation to confirm that the design is even a sound one worth building. So just did a revert, which ate a bit of my RAM. That number hasn't yet changed colors, which is nice. So everything seems to ignite every time, which is nice. But we did have one of the booster engines fail, which is unfortunate, which would really suck in a real mission because, as you saw, we just can't balance that out. If it was late enough, like if I caught, if it was late enough in the ascent and I noticed, oh, one of those is failing and we're having trouble tipping back, I could just dump both booster engines, but that early into flight, it wouldn't be enough for us to really do a test of this craft or not. That might be the move that I would make if it was the real flight, If I wanted to try to recover the mission, it just wasn't the move here in a simulation. Let me try to remember, make things bright, a little brighter. Maybe it's just my screen being more dim than I usually have it, but I'm just going to brighten it up a little bit. And you can see the horizon. We're not that far away from sunset or sunrise or something. So I really like the Atlas vehicle, and it's, it was used with the Able stages, it was used with Agena A, Agena B, and Agena D, and then kind of evolved versions, kind of more powerful versions of these engines keeps getting used up through even when they use the Centaur upper stage. So it's a really nice craft historically, and the model in FASA looks decent. I'm not sure if the reflection plugin is working perfectly on it now. Usually it should be shinier, or normally it's shinier. That's definitely something that I want to make sure is working nicely for me in 1.1. Of course, somebody has to rebuild the reflections plugin for 1.1, because it just makes things look so much better, particularly Soviet things, like Raider Nix parts. That's just, polished metal looks nice if it's got the proper reflection. But the downside of these Atlas vehicles is the delta V reporting. It's hard to just in the VAB estimate, will this craft, just based on the delta V numbers, will it be able to perform the mission that I want to perform? And that's a lot harder to tell with this particular vehicle, because you get to choose when this ring drops. And so MechJeb just assumes you're going to hold on to it forever, so it's always going to report less delta V than you're actually going to get. As you're pushing heavier and heavier upper stages, and you actually retain those booster engines for longer and longer, that matters less and less. But right now, the Agena D it's a heavier upper stage than anything I've pushed with the Atlas before, but the Atlas can still definitely handle it. So, what else? There's another interesting concept I wanted to talk more in depth of. Maybe I'll leave that till the next series of this, but you might just, if you're kind of new to Realism Overhaul or kind of rocket stages and stuff in general, you might wonder why the Atlas can only deliver so much mass to orbit on its own, but by adding all these different upper stages, it becomes so much more capable. And that's a really interesting idea. So if I forgot to turn the RCS off on that. Oh well, I'll remember that when I pop the cover. So when you get in orbit, like let's say the Mercury mission, which just has the Atlas with no upper stage. So in getting the Mercury capsule to orbit, you have to carry both the Mercury payload itself, as well as, I'm waiting for about 2 minutes 14 seconds or so, because that's a historical number I looked up from BNUMS, which is a German website with a bunch of cool rocket details. So it has to carry the dry weight of both this core stage and that center engine, as well as your payload. That's what it has to get into orbit. And drop. There we go. See, G-force is dropped, but still pretty high, even well above 1. So this has to get into orbit as well as our payload. But with this upper stage, and let me check pressure. Yeah, it's come down enough, and open the clamshell. There we go. That's a lot lower than I drop it normally, apparently. So with the Agena, this does not have to make it to orbit at all. This big heavy tank is going to make it to most of the velocity of orbit. So that's kind of energy that's wasted in a way, because what we're pulling up to that speed is the kind of dry non-fuel weight of this stage. But we don't have to bring it all the way up to orbital speed. We jettison it, and we have the much lighter upper stage and all of its fuel that has to make it to orbit. So that's why you want to have kind of as incapable, like the upper stage, you want it to be capable of just what you need it to be capable of. Like if I could tweak the thrust and mass of the engine there, I'd probably go with a lighter engine, because the Agena engine is something I'm going to have to drag to orbit. Right, I'm going to have to pay all the mass, all the energy. I could, if I had a lighter engine that could do the same thing, that's more fuel I could bring to orbit, so that's more I could do with it. And so that's why adding these more capable, larger upper stages allows you to deliver so much more delta V with pretty similar craft mass. And it's a fine-tuned balance, which is, it's definitely an advanced concept. It's a difficult concept to balance in your own custom craft for in Realism Overhaul or RP-0, and that's why I like to illustrate it with historic craft. I mean, that's how I kind of learned a lot of these concepts. It's nice to illustrate and learn it through how and why these historic craft did what they did. So now I'm just watching these times. So I want them to be similar. So really the only three numbers that matter to me at this moment are how much time is left in the stage, how much time till AP, and what's the actual peak height we're going to be hitting. And so this is getting high enough, I think it's fine. So I'm just going to have it hold prograde, and that should be good. Actually, I'm going to point it not prograde, because in the last couple of seconds I want to pitch up a bit. I want to get the upward velocity. That's what I want to optimize for at stage burnout, but not necessarily the actual physical altitude or actual AP. So I want to add that velocity just at the last moment to give the Agena a bit of a lob, a bit of an easier shot at achieving orbit. There we go. So we definitely wandered off inclination, so let me see if I can correct that a bit. Whoa, not that way apparently. Okay. So yeah, usually this just kind of happens for me in the background, that this number just works out for me because I'm kind of following the lines well enough. But clearly this time I have failed. So I've wandered off inclination, so I'm going to have to waste some energy to get back into the path. So in practice, in my previous test, I got the Agena into orbit with about like 3,300 meters per second of delta V, which is like it's a healthy bit. It leaves me a little bit of a margin. So I might end up with less this time. So that's an interesting way to illustrate that, I think. So yeah, time to AP still almost a whole minute. So I'm not even going to pitch up. But if this was, say, like near zero, like if we were just peaking or something, because this stage burns out with such a high thrust-to-weight ratio, see, if I just pitch up, say, just a little bit there, that time starts to increase, relatively substantially. Whereas the next stage just doesn't have that amount of ability and control to do that. So there we go, settle it out, and there we go. So yeah, this upper stage, see, we're jettisoning all that dead weight of the first, the earlier stages. I still have this real plume bug. So much lighter and less capable engine overall. Just has a lower thrust, but it's less mass we're going to have to carry to orbit. And so we had to carry the dead mass of that first stage, dry mass of that first stage that far, but no further. That's why it's such an advantage. Okay, just like the like a random example out of left field is, say, Skylab. So it used the first two stages of the Saturn V. So in practice, it actually had to carry the second stage of the Saturn V, which is like, I don't know, maybe like 100 tons, something like that, of dry stage mass to orbit. Whereas if the Saturn IB was getting it into orbit, that's a much smaller amount of mass that it has to carry into orbit. Just as another example, or the SLS, if with a lighter upper stage, the core stage, the giant first stage core tank, gets carried closer to orbit. Whereas in practice, you don't care if that gets closer to orbit or not. You're not going to use it in orbit, so you want to be able to abandon it at as low of a velocity as you can get away with. That's why having these large lofted upper stages makes more sense. This is like a really optimal combination for this time period. The Atlas Agena is very powerful, sending a lot of probes for America to the moon. I think the first lunar orbiter, which was creatively called Lunar Orbiter, was carried on an Atlas Agena, if I'm correct. They kind of tried to do that with a Thor Able or an Atlas Able. I don't remember what was the first stage. Maybe it was an Atlas Able, but that would have been a much smaller probe that got into that was able to achieve lunar orbit in comparison to what they achieved using the Agena the Agena B or Agena D upper stage. And having relightable engines is really a game changer. It really lets you start thinking about different kind of mission parameters. Because if you remember our previous attempts to throw stuff at the moon, like it was, okay, we burn out a stage and then we kind of light a bunch of solids in a row. We weren't able to relight any of those stages, so we just lobbed what we lob what we can into the air and then hopefully shoot the rest at the moon with their single ignitions. So I'm pitching up a bit because this got to negative, so time to AP goes crazy. And actually the fact that that number doesn't go negative is one of the things, totally tangential, but it was kind of making my flight computer a bit unhappy, because I'd like to have a nice continuous function, so I could have a function that relies on this number and that it passes through 0 and then becomes a negative number, rather than just jumping up to a very large positive number. So that was an interesting challenge, that of kind of what parameters am I feeding into my, my KOS flight computer. There we go. So we have pretty much achieved orbit. Let me just kind of try to level off a bit. So way less delta V than I had last time, but there, achieved super, oh, maybe not quite orbit there. 140 versus 150. Sorry, I'm just used to the old numbers. Is that on the downstroke? No. So I see I'm going to head up to the peak altitude before I head back down. So depending on where the moon is, that might be enough. So let me just do a logic check. Like I've designed this before, but what do you say? Do as I say, not as I do. So I may not spend the money. I think maybe I've got the time. So I definitely should have locked these tanks in the VAB. See, now it's only RCS down here that's going to be wasted, because I want to keep as much fuel in those upper stages as I possibly can. So I just, in practice, usually lock those tanks or have these turned off with an action group. Just this time I forgot that. So I'm probably not going to throw this at the moon just because the video is getting long, but maneuver node planner. So I want to use, not transfer to another planet, home and transfer. Okay, and I've already selected the moon, so I just tick. So it's going to tell me where should I burn. 45 minutes from now. And see, so close. So even though I kind of flubbed the relative inclination, I'm not at 0, so I'm not going to be coming right at the equator of the moon, or whatever the real term is. I apologize, egg. Let me go focus. I'm still going to be able to impact the moon, or do a ring around the moon. So even if you have a bit of an error in this, I like to mention both what you're optimizing for, like you'd like this to be 0, but what's the consequence? So here I'm off by almost 3 full degrees, and I'm still going to be able to hit the moon with my payload if I want, or be able to kind of just get a close encounter. All right, I don't want to make longer videos, but I'll make a longer video. All right, so let's just go point this, just below the hydrazine, just let MechJeb do it. So if you notice the way I've got these thrusters set up, some will point backwards, so it'll thrust me forwards, and these 4 are pointed around the periphery, so it can control the direction I'm pointing like this, but I don't have any roll thrusters, and that's on purpose, because in practice I don't need roll control of this craft. See MechJeb will overshoot like that a lot of the time, unfortunately. And I think it's just because it's not super aware of the different RCS fuels of Realism Overhaul. Which is something that might get worked into MechJeb in the future. There's more important things for MechJeb to be doing now, like things that help everybody, like 1.1 updates and such. Pretty much any improvement to MechJeb that helps stock probably helps Realism Overhaul players, but not the same way, and not the other way around. So I'm just trying to point at the target here, and then I'm going to cheat persistent rotation, as I always do when I'm making a video. There we go, and then just nail it to it. Oh, and the avionics, I believe the avionics in this are powerful enough, so toggle power, so shutdown avionics, they're modern enough that I could shut down. So you see the power reduction, so it uses less power to activate avionics, and it also shows how much how much power it's using. So 250 watts is 1/3 of an EC, so 1 electric charge unit per second is a kilowatt, so 1,000 watts per second. So the avionics of the upper stage plus this is what adds up to that. And when you time warp, some amazing coder, possibly Nathan Kell, was clever enough to set it up so that when you time warp, it automatically puts itself to sleep to save you power. So that's why you can see I could just be in time warp for 61 days here. So I'm just watching for the, whoa, oh, right. Yes, indeed, indeed. So that's what I get for telling it that it has the ability to knock me out of time warp globally. I'm just going to have to live with that, I guess. Okay. Oh, and so, yeah, see, I'm going to have to spend a little extra funds to be able to simulate this. Oof, I'm going to have to do it a few different times. And fight with time warp getting killed all the time. Lovely. Okay, so let me just quickly save it. Come on. So the way I was suggesting that I just cheat this, one way to do this simulation would just to burn prograde right now, just to confirm I have enough delta V, confirm that I have enough control to point in what direction I want. And so that's a way to do a simulation on the cheap. Simulate something similar to what you actually want to do, not the precise thing. Because like if the thing you want to simulate is dropping into lunar, fine, I'll just collect the science but not transmit it. Maybe it'll shut up. Okay. So let's say the thing you want to simulate is putting yourself into lunar orbit after a flyby. So in practice, it's going to take 2, 3, 4 days to fly. Yes, to fly to the moon. In practice, that would cost a lot in simulation costs, as Agathorn is finding. So one way to get around that would be, while you're learning, you can go in and change the settings to for simulation costs are 0, and that might be one of the things we recommend for people starting RP-0, because it's a learning process, right? You shouldn't necessarily be punished for doing simulations if you're new to the game, and you're new to all the other things that are being thrown at you, like avionics is an entirely new concept that's being thrown at you. So I'm actually so this engine is on. I'm going to save. I'm going to try something. So notice how this is set a bit higher. So I do like, MechJeb isn't perfect for carrying out maneuvers for you in Realism Overhaul, but because it's not ullage aware exactly. You have to do your own ullaging and be aware of that. So I've pointed myself kind of in that direction. I'm going to tell it to execute the next node, so it's aware of all the things it needs to use. So it's going to jump out of time warp shortly before that, because it can estimate. And then so once it falls all the way to time warp, I'm going to have to do the ullaging myself. I'm going to have to settle the fuel here. Sorry, if I'm not sure if I'm using an unfamiliar term for you. So I'm just holding H, thrusting forward enough to settle the fuel. Come on, please settle. Come on. There. Oh, there we go. All right. So it took a bit because I don't have much thrust with these, and it throttled up, and there we go. So now I can turn off my RCS. See, so MechJeb was able to carry out that no problem. I set up the maneuver node. I made sure that you don't want this to be too low of a number, or else that's what causes it to flip and behave weird right at the end of the node, because MechJeb is coded kind of assuming that it can throttle down gradually at the end to precisely hit the maneuver node amount. In Realism Overhaul, you can't actually throttle down engines like that, pretty much like for almost anything. So the way you can combat that is by increasing this number. This is kind of an average number I set it to. You can go higher. I wouldn't suggest any lower than 0.3. Yeah, so you just have to kind of know what MechJeb is doing to be able to use it for this, because I honestly use Maneuver Planner and these various tools for most of my testing and play of Realism Overhaul and RP-0, just because it's so good at that. You just kind of need to know what it's doing. So it'll time warp to shortly before the burn, and you have to know when it's going to do it right. So if it's showing like a sane estimated burn compared to what you actually have or need, like here it's it's not quite right, 30 seconds versus that. It's not anyway, but it's close. It's pretty close, and so that will be sufficient. It just popped out of warp before. It made a good estimation of kind of putting half of the delta V before the maneuver node instant, that very 0 second, and half of the delta V after that. So that's roughly half the time before and after that is a good way to straddle that, but in practice you want half the delta V before and half after, which is a much more difficult calculation. And it should shut itself down when it hits that, or it might fail to hit that, and no, it looks like it completed it. So now let's go take a look. It was actually able to get a collision course with the moon. So right now I'm just tapping H, just so you can see what I'm doing. So I'm using that extra, the reason I brought this hydrazine, and I did a hand calculation beforehand, so I have 50 meters per second worth of hydrazine in this. That might have been without the payload, but that means that if I point and thrust forward, I'm just holding H right now, I can't do the opposite. I can't hit N, and of course it did that. It loves to do that. But see, because of how I've positioned my thrusters, I don't have quads down here. I don't have a quad of thrusters down here like I have up there. So here I could thrust prograde or retrograde with that RCS, no trouble. But with this, I can only thrust prograde. not retrograde. But that was sufficient. So I know I'm going to get a pretty close pass of the moon. Basically, the Agena is spent at this point, and I'm just using it to kind of control this on the way to the moon. I might use this for a mid-course correction or something like that, but really, the simulation was an astounding success. And I might end up having enough delta V in the upper stage of this, because it's an engine you may be unfamiliar with. I'll show it off a bit more when we do carry out this mission, not as a simulation. It doesn't have an ignition limit. It's basically a large RCS is a good way to think of it. It just thrusts 1 kilonewton, which isn't a ton, and you can kind of reconfigure it like RCS to burn various fuels. So I've configured it to burn hydrazine, just like I've configured these RCS to burn hydrazine as well, because it's efficient, expensive fuel. Hydrazine is a good one though. But I think that's about it. Everything was a success. I don't see an option to just transmit data. Oh, yeah, sure. It's a simulation. Why not? I just would like to just have it popped out, even though didn't want to transmit data right now. But yeah, resounding success. I got not a huge payload mass. So for instance, if I separate here before I finish the video, so you can see this, let's call it a transfer stage, right? The Agena got us to orbit, and it also delivered the delta V to throw us at the moon. It got, this whole bit is 1 ton, TLI, so translunar injection. That's how much it could throw at the moon. But really, the useful payload it threw was, come on, tap, was that, like just under 200 kilograms of actual craft it was able to throw at the moon, which is enough. That's enough to throw something useful at the moon, or if I design this a little lighter, or did things a little different, I might be able to get enough delta V to throw something at Mars or Venus. But this is a capable craft. It's light. It isn't the biggest thing we'll ever be building, but it's a very capable craft. And again, thanks Schnobs for sharing this craft. But yeah, it's a perfectly capable craft for flying by the moon. It would be a perfectly capable craft for flying by Mars or Venus if I can achieve that. And this engine with the, here, let me unlock the tanks so it'll show me how much delta V it has. That might be enough to put me into lunar orbit. And if the maneuver node wasn't lying to me right now, I would actually be able to check. I would actually be able to just click and confirm whether or not that's going to be enough to get me into just a basic lunar orbit. And so I could put a similar payload on this, a little different, that could crash into the moon. And really, this is the point in RP-0 where you can start farming for cash, because once you can design a craft that's capable of doing that, of crashing into the moon or getting into lunar orbit, you're going to be rolling in money, because currently we have those contracts set as repeatable, and I find them fun as well. So I can do maybe I'm transmitting data. Yeah, it's trying to transmit the film. So that's going to eat all my power. But that's okay. It's a simulation. So reminder, don't capture film or buy certain experiments and try to transmit the data, because it will eat all your electricity. But yeah, thanks for watching. We designed and tested this craft. It behaved beautifully using our lovely new Agena B is what this is, not an Agena D yet, which was what I'll call it when it's capable of multiple relights. But yeah. Next, we will be building this craft for real and throwing it at the moon for real. And I'll do a little tweaking in the background to see if I can design a similar craft, possibly to crash into the moon, or potentially to successfully get to those other planets. Last quick thing. Notice I've got solar panels. This craft has efficient avionics, this early controllable core, so the solar panels are actually enough power to supply it. So we don't have to send big, heavy batteries once you can get the early controllable core, and if you're careful and design a beautiful little craft like Schnobs did here, yeah, you can power your avionics in or outside of time warp, because in time warp it uses even less power. You can power it with just solar panels, and obviously if I pointed it at the sun, we'd get more power. So thanks for watching. Goodbye.